So I'm gonna get us started now. Now that we've finally got the TV working, we got the pizza mostly eaten. I see some of you are still successing on that. We'll go ahead and get started with the presentation. As always, feel free to interrupt, ask questions, go on tangents. That's how we do things. And I am fielding the Restream chat for the Utah node. Good, it is actually streaming on the correct channel. Hopefully the titles were updated. If not, oh well. All right, here we go. So, MVC is dead. Long live MVC. That's why you're here, right? Or, to socialize and meet people and get jobs. So right off the bat, useful links. beyondcodebootcamp.github.io/prezos. You don't even actually need the long live MVC part because there's a link now on the prezos page. And I might try to actually move that up one to the main page. We'll see. But anyway, excuse me. Yeah, so if you want these slides, beyondcodebootcamp.github.io/prezos. That's where these slides are and other slides. And the video URL, if you are watching this on YouTube, you already have it. And for those of you that want to watch this in the future, it'll be right here because it will be right here. Okay, I'm ONeal. If you want to follow me on Twitter, @_beyondcode for the good stuff. I keep it code only on that one. And then Twitch TV, CoolAge86. I'm a dangerous wrong thinker, equal opportunity offender, and a technophobic technologist extraordinaire, meaning that I think most technology is terrible and will lead to our doom. I do Utah Node, Utah Rust. There we go. Okay, so MVC. It's a thing. It's a thing. But before that, let's consider some code. So we're going to get to what MVC is and why or why not. But let's consider some code. So in considering code, do I need to refresh this? Where's my, something didn't push. It's okay. So what I did was, the next slide was, code is for, no, it's not, it's later. Never mind. I got confused. Let's consider some code. So here we go. And we've got some code on the screen. So this is semi-realistic code. We're gonna break this down a little bit. So if we just focus on the first part, we have here, we're developing an API. That's what this code is for. And so we have a handler. This is API gizmos average cost. It's a request response handler, like what you'd have with Express. And then, so that's our starting point for this code. This is kind of the end result of what we're trying to ship is this bit here. So any questions up to this point? I know some of you may not be familiar with Express or APIs or something, so you can ask right now, ask the dumb questions now, so you don't have to ask them later. But I'll just move on. Okay, good. So then here you probably have some code that's something like this in lots of your own code, where you've got a database .get gizmos or whatever, and you're gonna maybe there should be an await there. In fact, there definitely should be a await there. Hey Josh, would you remind me to put an await there? And no big deal. So we're just getting some stuff from the database, and then we're gonna filter gizmos. I mean, technically, if we were using SQL, we could have done this in the SQL, but whatever. Point is, we get some data and then we need to do some stuff with some data. Sometimes the stuff you want to do with data is easy to do in SQL because it maps really well to relational algebra. Sometimes the logic around how you want to fetch data is maybe complex isn't the right word, but outside of the scope of what SQL does, and so you want to do it in code. But here we're going to filter out our gizmos. Also, there's a typo there that let shouldn't be there because we're not you can't shadow variables in JavaScript, but never mind. We do some stuff, we return some gizmos. Okay, then the next portion of this is that we're getting the total of all of the gizmos, what they cost, with some imagined function pluck cost here, and then we're going to get the average by dividing the total by the number of gizmos, and then why did that do like that way? Well, whatever, that's fine. And then we're going to give this back to the user as average. So I'm going to go back here and just, if there's any questions about the code, because I just want to make sure we understand the code in its pseudo form first. Yes?
You use the term shadow a variable. I've never heard that term.
So you don't do it in JavaScript. You do it in... shadow a variable means that you redeclare a new memory location and then you assign something. The previous name is no longer usable. So for example, let's say that let gizmos here gave you back an array of numbers.
Right.
And then let's say that here our transformation was that we wanted to turn gizmos into strings. This is one of the primary reasons you'd want to shadow a variable, is if you want to say parse something from the command line and go from a string to a number. And so the variable name is the same because it's say number that user entered, and then first you assign it as a string, and then you parse it, and then you assign it as a number. And so shadowing is when you can have a variable declared multiple times, but the latest declaration of the variable is the only one that is in effect in both its type and its allocation. So you would not be able to access the previous one.
So having that second let there would, in theory, have it point to a separate space in memory?
Yeah.
And that's not...
But JavaScript doesn't do that.
Okay.
JavaScript doesn't do that. And I don't think it ever could for other reasons. But yeah, good question. Any questions about the code as written? It's contrived, but I think that it's contrived well enough that it makes sense. Okay. All right, moving along then. So this is the thing that you got to buy into in order to buy into kind of what I'm trying to describe here. Code is for humans. And I say this because if we were writing for the machine, we could just use machine language. The only reason that we use programming languages, and the reason that we have so many programming languages, is because code is for people. The purpose of code is to make it easier for a person to interact with the computer, not to make it easier for the computer, because the computer, it has a CPU. We could just write directly to the CPU, and the computer would be, it would have no feelings about it because it's an inanimate object, but it would do just as well. And then more particularly, code is for dumb humans. I say this because we all have limited capacity in our brains, and no matter how smart or clever you think you are, you're not. And the more you live, the more you realize the dumber that you are, and the person that you're writing the code for often is you, and you 6 months from now doesn't remember what you 6 months ago did, so you find out you're not as smart as you thought you were. So code is for dumb humans. So this is important. This is the whole of what we're talking about here tonight. So we break ideas into paragraphs. Therefore, code should read like paragraphs. So I just want to go back to this real quick. I mean, when you saw it like this, did it seem, I mean, it's a 12-line example, 9-line example? I mean, maybe, but when you just stare at a wall of text, it's not super readable, right? So we want to break things down to make them more readable. And that's why we had this nice highlighting here, because if I just said, on line 2, it's a little confusing, but if we highlight it and then we talk about line 2, line 3 through 5, blah, 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 it's a little easier, right? Okay, so that's what I'm getting into. Is code should read like paragraphs. So if we just break this up like this, if all we do is add some line breaks here, it becomes a lot easier to talk about stuff. I mean, the reason we have indentation is to make it easier for people to read. The reason that we have white space makes it easier for people to read. So if we separate this into paragraphs, basically we have our encompassing body there, and then then we've got the component parts, and you can see the parts out of the whole. And this is all relevant. So code needs comments. So now if we put some comments in the code, now it's a little bit easier. The code is longer. There's more lines that need to be traversed. But aside from the fact that these comments are absolute garbage, this is more readable code. Now we've broken it up so that it's not just a wall of text. It's got some white space, just like we do when we're writing a paper or writing a message to someone. Hopefully you young kids have learned that you can actually use the return character in your text messages when you're writing a 150-page text message. Okay, but the problem is code shouldn't need comments. So how do we get rid of the comments? And the purpose for this is because if we change what Gizmo whatchamabob does, you may or may not end up changing the comment. And so a lot of times you go into code and the comment says the wrong thing. And this is confusing and frustrating. Okay, so if we want code that doesn't need comments, then we could have we could pull some of the stuff out into functions. So get upside down gizmos is now this. And so now we don't need a comment for what this is doing because we have a function that is named after what it's doing. And a lot of times what will happen is if you need to change the internals of a function, you may also need to change what a function accepts. And so if the function changes greatly, it's more likely that you'll change the name of the function with the code than it is that you'll change the comment with the code. I mean, even the fact that in your code editor, the comment is grayed out, whereas the function name is highlighted, kind of bears on this significance. And again, this is all relevant to the MVC stuff that we're going to be talking about. Okay, so now, so this is the database part, and we're just kind of taking the parts that are related to the shape of the data, we're putting it in one place. And now we've got our gizmos, calculate average price. So this is the kind of stuff that we want to do with gizmos. We've got calculate average price is one of the things that we want to do with gizmos. And so we put a few lines in here. And again, if the way that, say that we needed some option, we're only going to calculate the average price of red gizmos, then we might come back here and then add another parameter or something. And then if it needed it, then maybe we would change the name of the function as well. So, and then our show average cost, this is kind of, now this is just the highlights. We don't need the comments anymore because get upside down gizmos, that's what we're doing there. We don't need a comment about why we're filtering it out. We're filtering it out to get the upside down ones. And then I forgot the prefix here, so I'll have to tag that as another thing I need to fix. But gizmos.calculate average price, and we're passing in gizmos, so we get the average price. So now this is also perfectly clear. I mean, you know, if something's named average, again, it's a small example. It's only a 9-line example, which is one of the counter arguments we're going to come up to against this thing in a bit. But so now in sum total, router, when we have a get gizmo of average cost, we're going to show average cost. So now we have broken down our code into 1, 2, 3 pieces, and then our router, so we can expose this as an API. So any questions about this process that we just did here? I'm going to let that sit for 30 seconds. Also check the chat for any comments in the chat.
Now you only have to hop through 4 tabs of code to make a change.
Yes. Yes, that is the primary opposing comment. And you're not wrong. Yeah. Anything else?
It is also more modular, so if you have to use those functions in another place, DYI. Drive, sorry.
DRI?
DR, yeah, sorry.
DRI.
DRI, sorry, excuse me.
Do it yourself.
All right.
Don't repeat yourself.
So, yeah, when we're taking something that's only 9 lines long and we're only looking at one particular thing that we're going to do, this is the better approach, honestly. If this was the code that I was shipping to the customer, this is what I was paid to deliver, was this, and then my job is done. This, I think, is the correct approach. So I'm gonna accept that, and it's one of the things that makes this presentation hard to give in slide format, because by virtue of the fact that you're contriving an example that fits in slides, you're contriving an example that is more complex to show across 4 slides than it is to show across 1 slide. So this is a key counterpoint. So now let's talk about MVC and what it is. And some of you may have preconceived notions about it. I'm not going to ask you what those are because I'm probably not going to go that route. So MVC, MVVM, MVP, they're all just terrible names. They're just fancy names for what is really an emergent property of code readability. But it stands for, the M stands for model. And the model means how you are accessing the shape of the data. So it's your storage bits, so your database, maybe your file access, maybe network API access, and then some of the logic around that data and its shape. And does everybody understand what I mean when I say shape of data? So shape of data is literally, when you look at JSON that's been pretty printed, it has a shape to it. And that shape is because of the property names that you have and the types that you have, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's why it's called the shape of the data is because it's the silhouette of the data. What does the data look like?
Gotcha.
Right? So it's kind of like the cloud because we draw a cloud for networking, the shape of data because the data has a silhouette to it. And if you add a new property, then the shape of the data literally changes. The silhouette that you draw around the properties changes.
Got it.
So that's why we say shape of data.
Essentially, TypeScript. That's what the intent of TypeScript is to define the shapes.
Yeah. Yep. So that's the model idea is that your person object, your gizmo object, and then some of the ways that you interact with it in its data-esque form. And then the V stands for view, but again, I wouldn't care that you know what MVC actually stands for because the things are so dumb and irrelevant. Model doesn't mean anything to anybody. Storage makes sense. View, oh, whoops, a couple of these went out of order. That's okay. So the other thing I was going to say about storage is that you can kind of know when you're dealing with your storage layer when you're writing functions that are like find or get by or query, that kind of thing. Okay, and then I'll have to flippy do these slides so they go in the right order next time. But then the view is the presentation layer, and I think this is something that especially in the modern world, because MVC used to be something people talked about a lot, maybe 5 years ago. And I think that we maybe talked about it too much, and then all of a sudden we went from talking about it maybe too much and having maybe too many computer science-y theoretical applications to it, to just not talking about it at all. And I think one of those reasons is that the view layer really broke down because we discovered, hey, there's actually more things that we want to do. We want to make what basically React kind of took over and became everything and kind of destroyed the idea of MVC because React is all the things.
I was going to say, I felt like MVC died off when single page apps came into play and suddenly,
Well, Angular was still a single page app.
yeah, that's true.
It was the transition from Angular being the top dog to React, changing it from component architecture instead of MVC.
Yeah. Well, I think that they are not diametrically opposed, but I'll maybe get to that a little bit later. But the main thing that I wanted to touch on here is that your presentation layer is not just HTML. I think this is one of the reasons that MVC is dead is because it's like, oh well we're not rendering all this HTML on the server side, except now we are again, whatever. So therefore MVC is going out the window because now there's no view anymore, and this is absolutely incorrect because you could call it the presentation layer or the interaction layer. This is how a person interacts with what you have provided. And that could be a user interface in a web browser or on a phone. That could be a command line application with flags and arguments, etc. Or it could be the API, because as a developer, you are a user of this thing that exists out there. It does have a presentation layer. What you are interacting with as a developer is often the JSON. And so the JSON is, in fact, a presentation. So that was maybe getting a little bit ahead of myself. But how do you know you're dealing with a presentation? Presentation layer. If you see a bunch of curly braces, you're probably dealing with a presentation layer. If you see some consoles or prints, you're probably dealing with the presentation layer. If you see a response.write, response.json, that's kind of the litmus test here. And then you have C is for controller in MVC. And this one I think is actually really two parts, depending on the application. We'll get into that in a little bit. But the controller is the business logic or the testable stuff. And I think that this is the defining feature of MVC as an emergent design, as I will reference it, is that you've got the things that are the special pieces that you care about. Because the shape of the data is just there because it must be there. And how you select or filter something, some of that you could consider. The layers bleed. There are no pure abstractions. So there's always going to be a little bit of what you might consider to be business logic might be in the model, and this might be appropriate or it might be inappropriate. There's not a hard and fast 100% certain rule on that. But anyway, the controller is where you're going to have a lot of ifs and fors. And I think in particular, something I didn't put here, but I think the presentation layer is where you're going to have dot catches. And the business logic layer is where you're going to have throws. And that, I think, is actually an important litmus test of distinction, which you'll have to ask me about that because I may not actually talk too much about that as part of this. So with this as kind of, this is the kind of general idea of the architecture pattern is what I just showed, is that we want to separate and give definition to a model, a view, and a controller. And I think that this is not something that needs to be, let's see, dare I say, adhered to militantly. I believe in adhering to things militantly. But it's that as your application grows, when you have a very tiny application, and this is your application, then trying to split things up and come up with here's a directory for all my models, and here's a directory for all of my view stuff, and here's a directory for all of my business logic. The smaller your application is, the less you want the overhead of that stuff. But the problem is that as your application grows, then it starts to become confusing, you may have noticed, if you have a lot of logic scattered all throughout the application. So if I want to know, okay, what do I need to do to make sure that my, say, the access to the file storage is secure? Well, there might be 50 places throughout the app where you're doing pretty similar things. And now if you want to go refactor some part of that, you got 50 different places that you might need to touch. And so that's kind of where it's hard to give a good code example in a slide, but just that idea of you want to limit the number of places that you have to touch. Really, it's not so much about change as it is about understanding what something's doing, how to know that something is operating correctly, and then also the ability to throw something away. A lot of times you'll hear the idea of don't repeat yourself, or the idea of code reusability. But I actually would say that the better thing to think about is how do you make it easier to throw code away? And I probably didn't give a good example of that right there, but that's okay. We'll just move on anyway. Okay, so why is MVC dead? And we kind of talked about this already. We don't put mustaches on Rails anymore. So people don't believe in the view layer, which is kind of the thing that for some reason MVC got the most love, probably because it's the most interesting as JavaScript comes on the scene. We don't put mustaches on Rails anymore. So therefore the view layer is dead, which again, I don't think that this is actually true. I don't think that just because we're not using HTML, this doesn't consider that your API is a view layer. This doesn't consider that your CLI, which hopefully you have, because heaven knows you'll have such a better time with your application, both debugging, developing developer tools, developer SDK, all of that stuff, if you have a CLI. And the CLI will also help you develop these natural distinctions in your code of where logic needs to go.
What's the CLI again?
Command line interface.
Okay.
So I want to be able to, from the command line, say, purchase a widget. 0.001% of your users are going to purchase a widget through the terminal.
Yeah.
But as a developer, oh gosh, it's so nice to be able to script some integration tests with Bash. Or, I actually kind of think the idea of purchasing things through the terminal would be awesome. But anyway,
Do you remember which service added buying domains through the terminal? Was it like Surge or something like that? Does anyone know?
I did that with Daply.
I was about to say.
That's the only dollar that we ever made where we actually delivered a product. Oh. Okay, so models are dead. The reason models are dead is I think that they were widely misunderstood. Just like I was talking about the that was supposed to be the views are dead slide. Anyway, models are dead because one of the things that people used to sell on the idea of MVC is that you're going to be able to change your database out. And I think this is just a ridiculous idea. How many times have you changed your database? And even if you ever have, how many times did it go smoothly no matter which technology you were using?
We're doing that at work.
We're not really. I mean, we have another database.
Yeah, we have Postgres.
We have a second database, but we're not changing the database. That we will never be able to get all of those tables and everything replicated in another database. You can add a database, but you can't swap a database. And if you could swap a database, then why would you want to? Because that would mean that there's no unique value in what you're doing in your storage layer. Because if what you're doing in your storage layer can be so perfectly abstracted that you could easily switch between databases, then why would you want to?
The only argument I could come up with is like going from like an on-prem to a cloud database, which AWS would do all the backups and stuff like that.
Well, but still, I mean, you'd stick with the same database. You just have MySQL.
You're not
You would,
changing your model to interface.
yeah, you're just changing which computer you connect to. But anyway, so that's my point here. Is I think that many of the things that people touted about models and the MVC stuff isn't actually useful. Another thing I see, this is kind of my complaint with objection in Node, which is a SQL wrapper library that works for Postgres and MySQL and SQLite, whatever, is you end up having all of your model logic still thrown into your business logic. You just wrap it differently, right? So one of the things with the idea of the model is we don't want to have our SQL necessarily in our route. Again, if you're doing a 9-line example and you want to put your select in there, whatever, I'm not going to stop you, right? But if you're actually building out a real application, if you have SQL all over the place, it just, I don't know how to articulate quite why. Maybe somebody else can, but it feels unwieldy to have SQL thrown across areas where something's going out to an API and areas where you're trying to do a business process. And if you are just abstracting the SQL with a SQL builder, it's kind of prettier, but you're still taking all of this logic that is relational algebra, combinatorial logic, and then placing it over in the view or the business logic layer. And again, I need to find a better way to articulate this, but and actually I think I kind of can a little bit later. If we go back to the slide where I showed not 3 but 4 things, I think I can articulate it, is that the code is not easy to test and describe if you have your query builder logic thrown into your controllers or your views, essentially. By controller meaning, like I established before, the business logic. Yes?
I don't know if it's really applicable, but just one thought that kind of came to mind is like GraphQL. You want your abstraction layer to be something that you can ask for, again, the shape of your data, not necessarily that kind of separation.
I get exposing something as GraphQL makes sense. Using GraphQL internally, I don't think, to me, doesn't make sense because GraphQL just adds complexity on top of
Oh,
complexity.
yeah, you wouldn't do GraphQL on your service side, but like exposing like a public API or whatever, GraphQL is a pretty nice pattern.
Okay. Yeah, views are dead. Kind of talked about that because we don't use mustaches anymore. But again, I think this misses the point because we have other ways of viewing things. And then the controllers are dead. One of the things that I don't think is a great argument that when people, again, I think that the pattern, the general pattern, the MVC, MVVM, MVP idea is generally good. It's an emergent design. The reason that we have so many things with similar acronyms that are so similar to each other because as people are building more code, they find that there are some natural separation boundaries. But one thing that you're not going to get is generic reusability. And the big reason for this is that when you make things generically reusable, you make them less useful and more complicated. And also, you're not generally going to be reusing your business logic. You're building an application. You're not going to export that application in the general sense. You're not going to be exporting that out for people to build on top of the application. At least not the application code. They might build on top of the API. But the idea that you're going to get better reusability, I think, is not really where the core benefit of MVC is, or the controller part of the MVC. I think the ability to isolate something that you want to throw away or replace, that's great, because that, I think, is more likely. But yeah, I don't think that the general usability is all that great. So, and then here's another thing that I actually thought was on point and terrible at the same time, but it also goes back to one of my first slides. So a design pattern is a crutch to use when you either have a mediocre team or they have to work with other mediocre teams. And then the long live MVC was actually supposed to be on a next slide, not here. So that's incongruous to have that here. But what I was saying when I said code is for dumb humans. I think that Todd, who he frequents the meetups, Todd Punk, which actually now I don't remember if his name is actually Todd or not. Yes, it is. It is actually Todd. Anyway, but I think that he's both spot on and completely wrong with this, and that yes, we create frameworks and design patterns so that we can communicate information more efficiently to people who have less knowledge and capability. But I don't think that necessarily means that you throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think that generally speaking, like I said before, preparing to share with dumb people is good because you will find that you are that dumb person 6 months from now. So, and then I didn't finish the rest of the slides because I worked on the examples instead, and I feel like the examples turned out really well. So I want to go back to those and kind of talk about this a little bit more. So here, so let's go back. So this is what I consider to be, I think this is a good model, and let me explain why, and also I want to have an opportunity for maybe some argumentation around this. And so that means you got to wake up, Christian. Yeah, I know, you fell asleep, but I think that you might be one to argue here, so I wanted to wake you up, and I'll repeat what I said. It's okay.
It's a long day.
Oh no, I get it. But I think you may actually have some valuable argumentation here, so that's why
Let's do it.
I woke you. But so what I'm saying is, I think that this is actually a good model encapsulation because it's not just saying, okay, how can I query build? This is actually describing a function that is perhaps something that I'd want to reuse. There might be multiple places throughout my application where I'd want to get upside down gizmos, maybe with some variation. Maybe I would add some arguments here or something. But there's a limited number of things that I want to do with gizmos, and most of the model libraries try to be extremely generic. They essentially try to be query builders. But I would argue that if you're using some sort of query builder, that the thing that you're doing with the query builder should be encapsulated in a function with a name. Now, if it gets to the point that you have 1,000 functions around gizmos for every single possible permutation of a query, then I think you've gone too far in the other direction. But if all you have is a query builder, and in every single place that you ever need a gizmo, you're repeating very, very similar queries over and over again, then I think you've also gone too far in that direction. So this right here is my argument of what a good model ought to look like given the fact that it's on a slide. You know, with all of this with the caveat that it's on a slide, we're not reviewing a real project with real code. Would have been great if I could have selected a real project with real code to go through this. But was that a stretching your hand, or was that a...
Stretching my hand, but I was also thinking, I feel like you did some of this stuff in the crowd node API and whatnot. So you could probably pull that up and it might be a decent example.
If maybe. I'm really not proud of the CLI portion of that yet because I wasn't originally intending to build it out that way. But where it will be at in another week or two, I think actually would be a pretty good code example. So maybe I will come around to showing some of that.
I mean, I know I learn by comparison a lot, so you could probably easily pick one of the functions in there, say like, this is pretty good, but this is how I'm intending to change it in the future to improve things or whatever, so that's just a thought.
Okay, let me bring up the crowd node stuff. Crowd node, here we go. So this is something for the Dash cryptocurrency. It's for basically it's called staking, but it's essentially putting something in a savings account is what it is. You take some cryptocurrency, you put it in a savings account, and you can earn interest on it. And that's what this was about. And this one, I feel like the library ended up pretty decently. CrowdNode.js might be the main thing here. What are you thinking about specifically? Does anything come to mind? Because
No, I just know you used a similar like pattern to what you're describing in how you were structuring your calls and stuff. And I mean, I didn't catch every stream, but I caught, maybe at least one a week. And so I was seeing how you were organizing it, and it seems in line with what you were just presenting, at least partially.
I think Insight might be what we could consider the model. It's an API, but Insight is basically for cryptocurrencies. There's this software called Insight that has a couple of different forks with modifications for different cryptocurrencies. But essentially it allows you to query the blockchain and figure out how many times has this address been used, how much money is remaining on this address, how much total money throughput has this address had. Basically the kind of things that you'd want to index on addresses and the monies associated with it is what Insight is. And so this is effectively the model, because this is where the core data comes from. It's not the business logic. And in what I've continued to build out called Dash Site, that's where this code actually ended up, which it will become a dependency of this, but get balance. So this I would consider to be a model function, more or less. Get unspent transactions, that's basically similar to get balance, but with some slightly different information.
Could you blow it up a little
Oh
bit?
yeah, sorry. Yes. Will blow up.
Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, I should have done that earlier anyway. So yeah, there's a get balance function. And this was the difference between, because Dash as a cryptocurrency has a different method of getting the balance because it does instant transactions rather than 30-minute confirmations. And so that's why this one, not that it's kind of going into the weeds on this particular project, but get unspent transactions is basically just the better way to get balance, because it will give you the actual current balance as opposed to the confirmed balance, which is Insight was originally built for Bitcoin, which is probably the worst technological possible solution. But, you know, first of its kind, worst of its kind. Anyway, get transactions. Yeah, I would say that this kind of follows that pattern. Get all pages. It does have some, we could call this controller logic in here. Instant send, in this case, is actually a function that will send instantly, as it sounds. But this actually goes to the other point that you were making earlier, Travis, which is that so here I actually do have model logic and business logic combined. I'll go back to the slide after this as well. But this is actually a component or a package, if you will. So the functions are organized by which functions deal with data. So each of these data functions is just a data function. All it does is transform data. It doesn't have any business logic in it other than the business logic or let me remove the word business. It doesn't have logic in it aside from the logic that's necessary to represent the data in the correct shape. So when I get the instant balance, I have to do a little bit of extra work to get the instant balance because I have to go over a number of transactions, and I have to figure out which ones are unspent, and then I have to sum them together. But it's still just presenting a shape of data. That's its purpose. And then down here, this send money function, this instant send function, it's in the same code. I don't have this split out into 4 different files. As you said at the very beginning, I don't have to go through 4 different tabs in order to understand what's going on. But I'm still following the pattern that at the functional level, my do stuff business logic is separated from my make a shape of thing logic.
A module, if you will.
Yeah, a module, a package, a component.
Are you exporting anything out of this, or is this?
This whole thing is exported. So all of these, everywhere you see insight dot whatever equals, so the exports are the insight.
And you start doing raw JS instead of MJS, or like you wouldn't do module or
Just doing common.
common JS.
Yeah, I do that because I don't believe there's any advantage whatsoever to using the other format. It just requires more complicated tooling.
What browsers are still in the wild that can't do modules?
Which browser is there that can't do JavaScript? I mean,
Modules are, I think, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole.
well, I guess okay. If you're trying to pretend that we live in a world where developers actually use HTTP2, then I would agree with you. But I have yet to encounter any development environment where people are relying on HTTP2. So if you're going to just throw a bunch of bundlers and transpilers at things anyway, so if your argument was, hey, if you make this into the MJS format, then you can export it and it can just work TM, that I could start to buy into. But the problem is that I don't ever see that actually used, and this ends up being easier.
I could be totally wrong, but I think that's kind of what the big, like, why Vivint is kind of picking up a bunch of steam, is it's doing away with a bunch of this old browser, like Webpack kind of transpilation stuff, and expecting the browsers to natively be able to do module exports and module imports now. Like, and I think the greenfield browsers are all at a pretty good spot that we don't necessarily need to.
No, I agree with that, but in terms of getting compatibility between a browser and Node, I think it's still easier to do it with just plain JavaScript. I mean, that's a different discussion, but basically what I need to do here to make this compatible with plain JavaScript is I just need to have exports.request or require request, and then this works in the browser and in Node equally well. Or if I'm using a bundler, which still most likely is going to be the case, then in my package.json I just replace I just do package.json.browser/request.js with /browser request.js, which is something that I actually need to do for this. So you,
All I'm saying is I think that we're pretty close to a point where in the module, if you want to use the .mjs extension to distinguish, but I think browsers are getting really close to just natively being able to import modules and stuff like.
I could definitely see myself moving over if we get to the point where it makes it easier to work between Node and browsers.
And V as a runtime or like as a development environment, it's really nice that you can just use that all kind of natively. You can just
Oh, oops.
in your config files and stuff don't have to use the requires commands anymore. You can just import and export.
Cool. Well, yeah, I think that would, as that progresses, I could see that as a reason for adopting MJS. I think that would be great. It's just kind of, to me, it seems a total rabbit hole tangent, but every time we invent a technology that solves a problem, we just run in the other direction. We created HTTP2, it solved pretty much every problem we ever had with bundling and JavaScript, and then we just said, screw it, let's abandon that, let's not do that. Let's not do something that doesn't give us enough to complain about on a daily basis.
I'd be totally wrong, but I think we're getting closer.
Well, that sounds good. I will actually be happy for that to happen, and I will say it here for all to see. I am open to switching over to MJS for that benefit. That sounds reasonable. I will have to investigate that a little bit, perhaps. But my main problem is just the node compatibility sucks so bad, because if you publish something MJS to NPM, it's kind of like the GPL or other types of code viruses, or same thing with promise APIs, right? If you make something a promise API, then if you change something as a breaking change, if you make something that wasn't a promise API now a promise API, it breaks everything in the whole chain. And that's kind of how MJS is you put one MJS module anywhere in your stack, and then all of a sudden you have to refactor dozens of modules, whereas you can use MJS at the top layer and not have to refactor anything downstream, which is why I think that it's still, as of today, it seems like it's better to publish in the plain format, because it's easier. Anybody, whether they're using MJS or not, can consume the plain format, but only people that are using MJS can consume the MJS format. And as I said, to convert over, you have to, it's going to blossom through your project disruptively.
A lot of third-party dependencies out there, but yeah, a lot of them are pretty far along on supporting it.
Cool. All right. So anyway, this is what I was saying. Back unraveling all the loops back to this. I think that this is actually an ideal pattern for what a model layer should look like. And again, the model doesn't necessarily. I don't think that you necessarily need to create folders to separate everything. I think that can be a good idea. It depends on the size and shape and scope of the project, whether you want to be separating things categorically versus by package. I think in general, separating by package is a better pattern, but if you are trying to incrementally make something that you have better, that might, I don't know, you have to take it on a case-by-case basis to kind of see. But in general, I prefer the package scope idea to the, okay, let's strictly make a folder that this is all the views and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. The one exception to that is routing. I think routing really does belong on its own, and there's a Matt Ryer talk I can reference about that, which is called The Things I've Learned About Web Services After 8 Years or something like that. I'll bring that up. It's on creedsofcraftsmanship.com. So if you go creedsofcraftsmanship.com and then look for Matt Ryer, How I Write HTTP Web Services After 8 Years. He talks a little bit about that too. Anyway, so that's the model bit. So here is the controller bit. And so this is correctly qualified business logic. This is something that is testable all on its own. Typically your model stuff is difficult to test. It's easy to know if it's right, but testing requires a lot of mocking, and I think that in most cases it's probably not worth testing, because you just kind of got to assume that your database works, and I don't know. It's kind of rough. So feel free to, give me some better pointers on that.
This is that side effects land, right?
Yeah, because you got to empty the database, and then a lot of times, in order for to test the relationship between things, you have to have 50 of each thing, and then you're going to want to test the 0 case and the 10 case, and it's easier to test that in the business logic layer where you just pass in a JSON object and say, okay, well, if I pass in an array of 0 gizmos, what happens? If I pass in an array of 1 gizmo, if I pass in an array of 2 gizmos, if I pass in an array, and generally those 3 cases are your edge cases, but let's say 3 and then 10 just to be complete. And see, do you get the right answer all the time? And I think it actually would be really good to test this with 0, because what would happen in that case? I should get 0. That's what should happen.
Testing negative.
Oh, if I divided 0 by 0, would I get 1 or undefined? Don't you hate it when math has multiple answers? This is how we know math is made up, because it's not consistent. If it was real, it would be consistent. Because if I were to just reduce this, x divided by x divided by x would be 1, but 0 divided by 0.
I think the divide by 0 gets caught in the processor, so that would have the higher priority interrupt.
I know that there's some things you can't divide by 0 because it causes an error.
But the numerator is it's insignificant in this case. Like, it doesn't matter what you divide by 0. That the divide by 0 is what blows up.
Okay. So, but the point being, this is something that is easy to test and high value to test. And because we pass in the gizmos, I don't put the model logic inside the business logic. The two can exist separately. Here's my model logic. How do I get the gizmos in the right shape, the right gizmos in the right shape? And then here's how can I do something with the gizmos? And this becomes testable. And I think that this is one of the benefits of the MVC pattern in the form that I'm describing, is that you end up with code that is hopefully easier to test. And there are some cases where that breaks down a little bit. I'm not clear what the right answer is, because you'll find that once you know what the average of the gizmos is, then you need to go get the widgets that are somehow dependent upon the average of the gizmos. And then once you go and get the widgets, then you need to fire off some action. And once you've done the action, you need, so you have these complex interactions between your models and your business logic and stuff. But I'll get to that in just a little bit. But I consider this to be, again, for what can fit in a slide, an ideal containment of business logic. And it wouldn't necessarily always fit cleanly. Here I have it scoped to a hypothetical gizmos package, but it may very well be that both gizmos and widgets are needed, and in that case, where do you put it? I don't know, maybe in the gizmo widgeter. Maybe there's a better name for that thing when it starts to combine things together. And then here, we've got our gizmo API, our view layer in this case. We're exposing an API. And what I wanted to do is show an average cost. And I think in more traditional MVC, this would be shown as the controller. And I think that this just kind of gets hand waved away as a utility function. But I think that it's actually important to distinguish between these two, because in this one, it's isolated. It's just shape of the right data. In this one, it's doing stuff with data. And in this one, it's the mix and match of all the things that we need. We're going to get the gizmos, we're going to do the calculation, we're going to give back the result. And then the routing is its own separate piece as well, which I don't consider this to be as much part of the MVC pattern as much as it is just your application is going to contain multiple sub-applications. So in my API, I essentially have a gizmos application, and that gizmos application is going to do some things that I'm exposing. And it's nice to be able to not have to have, even something that's short like this, if you've got hundreds of routes, it can be nice just to see, this is the routes file, these are where all the routes are, and so whenever I need to go find a route, I find out where the logic for that route is, and then I go backwards from there.
So
and
multiplexing based on that string input.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's basically what I got. And yeah, my belief is that it's not as much a religion as it is an emergent design. And although a lot of the libraries out there do a lot of things that why is the MVC dead? Why are people not talking about it anymore? I think it's because those things that I brought up, that some of the things that were touted so much are not actually that useful. The idea of changing databases is not that useful. The idea of templating HTML as what the view is useful, but not encompassing of the wholeness. And then the idea that you're going to generically take your proprietary business logic and export it somewhere, not so much. Unless you're just shipping it between your API and your CLI or something.
If you go back to the first all-in-one before you separated it out, separate things. Yeah, this one. I would say that from our perspective, since we do so much testing, we try to get 100% code coverage on this. This is difficult to test, right? Like when you have it like this, I would have to set up some client that knows how to talk to, so you don't have to have an HTTP server with an HTTP client. You have to have a website, whether it's Express or whatever, that gets to here, and then now I have to have it's too much, right? It's almost a monolith within its own context, and when you break it out, whether you call it MVC or whatever, but kind of separating things ideally into, let's say, a single responsibility paradigm into like a function to where I can say this piece of code is responsible for reducing this thing, right? And I can test that out of context of having a router, out of context of multiplexing, out of context of Express. It makes it much easier to comprehensively test your code base. And from our perspective as well, where we have to do those on-site deployments to federal government sites, and they have to, do dependency auditing and all the rest. It's a nightmare when you end up getting a bad actor in some dependency somewhere that's totally tied in with everything else. So if you end up getting that situation and everything is carefully partitioned over here and over here and over here, you can just carve out that one piece, refactor it, redeploy it, run all of your tests again, and everybody's happy, right? So, but again, when you kind of monolithically code like this, the ability to kind of bob and weave through those situations is almost impossible, right? So the abstraction layers actually simplify things in the long run in a large code base.
Yeah, I think the bigger the code base gets, the more true this is. I think when your code base is 9 lines, I'm going to argue we don't need enterprise FizzBuzz. If you have a microservice that all it does is transform an image in 2 different ways, by goodness, put those 20 lines in, inside of the router and you're good. But yeah, as the code base grows and this is where I think red-green refactor comes into play, because red is you've defined your target, you've defined your bullseye. Green is that you've written code that can get the thing to the bullseye, and then refactor is you take a look at your code. The scope of the code that you just wrote, as well as the scope of your code in a larger pattern, and say, okay, how can I make this more testable, easier to throw away?
So in lieu of calling things MVC, are you saying like functional programming, or is this component architecture, or is this modules or packages, or what are you saying to not call things MVC anymore, but instead?
I'm not saying to not call it MVC. It's just I wanted some good resources about MVC. I don't necessarily articulate things quickly in a coherent way. I have to kind of talk through them several times with several groups of people and get feedback before I can articulate things well. And So I was just assuming, the MVC approach, whether you want to go with the MVP style or MVVM or whatever, the general approach is something that's been well understood. And I was looking for some recent resources that speak to how we can do this. And I'm not giving the example here of the browser side, but you can take this to the browser side. I hope you can see how this can apply to the browser side as well. But I was just looking for resources, and none of the new kids had ever heard of MVC. And so that was surprising to me, because it's like, what, do they not have some sort of MVC talk at ReactCon, or, and so that's where the idea of MVC is dead, long live MVC, is that MVC is dead. It's not a thing anymore.
I feel like it's been taken over with just different language. You talked about it a little bit already with like the functional programming, for example. Like we talk about that more. We also talk more about state management as opposed to models. And in just the way that you approach these problems, it's all there, right? Like you were talking about silhouettes, for example, like the shape of an M, the shape of a V, the shape of a C is all inside of a React ecosystem. We just don't call it MVC anymore. Like I said, they're just taking different names on.
Well, but so I'm expecting something that has clearly articulated parts, right? So with MVC, MVP, MVVM, I don't think that we have to stick to the acronym approach, but generally things come in 2s, 3s, or 4s, right? So I'm expecting to hear recognizable words or acronyms, and so what are those?
I think in a React environment, the templating, in whether it's React or pick your favorite thing, the templating is kind of a view, right? You're kind of creating some presentation view based on a skeleton or a structure or whatever that you populate with data that you've taken from something called a controller. A controller in a React environment would be like just one of your functions that you have that you wrap up. And that's, again, calling and passing into whatever your HTML template is. And then there's some query that goes back into the database somewhere, or whether or not you have a layer in between, which is like an object, for example, that may have methods on it. That would be your model, right? I think that, again, it's all there. I just don't think that we call it model view controller anymore. It's just taken on more of the React specific jargon.
Exactly, yeah. The tricky thing with React too is that it itself has gone through several evolutions of architectural patterns and stuff like that. So like a big part of the model, if you will, the state management stuff was Redux. Mm-hmm. So that was a separation of concern through where you put all of your getters and stuff in a separate store directory, but all your components, which would be like JSX, would call into the Redux store. But Redux fell out of favor with all these, like a dozen other different flavors of, and then React itself has now more recently done their own provider consumer pattern. So it's an ever evolving thing, and it's hard to just put one name on it, but they all kind of follow an MVP design. It's just that there's different libraries, and the hardest part about React is it's a choose your own adventure story.
So what I want is for us to have some common terminology. So for example, if I wanna speak to this group and I want to talk about a design pattern, I need a name for that thing.
I would say that the React one is the component model, the component architecture, and in Vue they call it single file components. You know, your .vue files have a template section, they have a script section, and then they have like a style section.
But in that sense, the single file component is a model view controller.
Yeah,
But that's fine. That's fine. I mean, the
all
point that I'm trying to get at is to be able to speak about and identify these components and their benefits of breaking them down. And like I was saying before, whether the code is structured in such a way that seems to fit in a single file, or whether the code is structured in such a way, or the nature of the application is structured in such a way that it seems to be better across a directory structure, is not the important part. The important part is that we make a distinction between the type of thing that does the right stuff in the right shape, that does the business value logic, and that does the make available for interaction.
Yeah, I think that's what React's big selling point was to kind of componentize these things or modularize these things, or putting all of those shared concerns, even though they're written in different languages, like even HTML, CSS, and JavaScript can be thought of model view controller, where HTML is your model, JavaScript's your controller, and CSS is your view. The separation of concerns out to different files is kind of a new point. It's like grouping those concerns into a cohesive component or a module, or so. I'll stop talking.
Yeah, and I think that MVC often felt more of a monolith, whereas this component paradigm that we're referring to within React is more of like a bite size. It's almost like a microservice, if you want to think of it that way, to where you just kind of package up a small MVC as opposed to having this kind of larger, almost Ruby on Rails flavor.
Yeah, the Rails, I think, is what really made MVC popular, with stuff like Rails.
Well, I mean, every framework is based off it. Laravel.
For better or worse, yes.
Yeah.
So even in the component architecture, they used to call it dumb components and smart components, where you'd have your page level that's right off your route is kind of really thought of as your controller component, and all of its children are just kind of dumb components that you just pass the properties down to. So those quote unquote dumb components, I think there's a better term for it, but
That's what I would call them.
yeah, they just deal with the properties that they're getting. They don't have any magic logic to go out and run queries or talk to APIs. They're just, here's my properties and all the mid events or whatever.
By the way, for those of you that are joining in online, hey, nice to see everybody. Welcome. Oh, let me just, pardon me, folks in the room. Hello. So I'm AJ. For those of you that are just joining in, I imagine probably most of you have been on the channel before, but welcome. We are in the Q&A section, so I do have the chat up. Feel free to ask some questions or make some comments or whatever, and I will field those.
I will say for what 2 cents it's worth, because I've just recently started even doing programming, and I've only learned through Udemy, but the first Udemy course that I did actually was centered around the MVC model, and then when I started looking into React, it felt like it was a lot more bite-sized to even take in as somebody who the language of programming was foreign to me, just in the sense that I could take a small component, and I kept on getting lost with what what the MVC and how they were all communicating with each other. Whereas within React, when I first went through it, and granted, I don't know how much of this is a little unfair because I started learning React after I started learning some JavaScript, so that's also important to keep in mind. But it was a lot easier for me to have a small piece, kind of like you were saying, just very bite-sized, packaged, and just have that there. And I felt like you could even have components that do a lot more of a module type-based, data-based type structure. And that, I guess that made a lot more sense to me, who that was really foreign to.
Yeah, I think the basic principle of being able to identify these and break them down
Nice to meet you, man.
can apply each way.
Good night. Thanks.
So I think nowadays when you're dealing with HTML and especially single page apps, the single page app is so massive. I get what you're saying, but when I started, we had server-side includes. We had different ways of doing it where you'd be actually making very small HTML files, almost like components, and combining them into
Okay.
one larger app, almost in the same way, but it was all happening server side. And so the main paradigm shift here was, oh, well, that costs us a lot of money to have 50,000 users in our server do it. If we can get the 50,000 users to do all the cost of rendering the app, we don't have to pay for that. We just ship a little bit of code data and they render everything for themselves. And so it was actually offloading a lot of like business costs. I'm sure businesses just somehow managed to generate costs elsewhere or something. But that's how I saw the shift years ago, was you had server-side includes, or I can't even remember what PHP, maybe you were still kind of doing that with PHP, yeah, something like that. But it was still, there were still a lot of these ideas. It's just kind of shifted where it's being done. And now it's just funny because now it's circling back around to now the server-side rendering again. And you're rendering back on the server because it turns out rendering a static HTML page and providing that is faster than making a person's smartphone, no matter how great it is. Like, yeah.
I don't think that that's entirely it. I think it's that we've made the bar too low for people that work on the interaction layer.
Mhm.
I think that that's the problem, because when you look at mobile phones, the technology, well, and just web pages in general, the stuff that ends up being client facing, I don't think that there's enough engineers to go around it all, but there's not the right tooling and engineering going into those things. So they suck and they don't work and they're broken all the time. And if you have the people that are the more engineering minded that are writing the stuff on the back end perform the logic, I think that there's a higher chance. You know, the people that are higher skill level that are getting paid more, if you have them do more of the logic, then you end up with a better chance that the thing that gets delivered is better. And also, if you don't have any state at all, you do no state management because you just start fresh, then that also lowers the bar so that people that aren't dealing with the state management or don't, you know, people that are focused on CSS are just not going to be great engineers in general, right? If you're good at CSS, that is a skill set that is so apart from programming
Yeah,
that
but
it's
I'm good at CSS.
I beg to differ. I'm a CSS guy and I know JavaScript. What are you talking about?
I mean,
I'm
I think,
a
but
CSS guy and I know DevOps.
there are people that are both professional comedians and
I mean,
also
I'm not-
professional motorcycle bike riders,
I'm not
right?
even joking though.
What?
Like, I'm not even joking.
CSS
Like,
is awesome. I love CSS.
Yeah.
like
No,
there
but-
are actual front end designers that actually know software
You
engineering.
know, SaaS.
What?
There's actual front end designers that know software engineering. You just don't find them all the time.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Is that they're not complementary skill sets. They're not adjacent. They're not that adjacent of skill set. They're two separate skill sets that, because of business requirements, get jammed together.
See, I disagree because CSS has always been the view for me. Like, when I got into things, I guess not when I got into things, but when I started doing programming professionally for my day job, CSS was what everyone was using and had to learn it. And it was a little bit difficult at first, but I kind of already knew most of it because I was using style tags inside HTML. And so once I realized how to separate it out, that was just how I did the view. And it was actually, it still is for me, easier to do that way because I can shift my mind into, okay, I'm worrying about how this is gonna look now. And so I can shift into, it's okay to have a slightly different syntax for how it's gonna look, because now I can get off of the JavaScript or I can get off the structural HTML and actually like,
I'm 100% with you. I'm not arguing that point at all.
Okay, then I don't understand the point you're arguing.
I'm saying that the two skill sets are not likely to come in common. I'm not saying that they don't come in common. So literally, there are professional comedians who are also professional motocross, right? Literally, there are professional bakers who are also professional landscapers. So these skill sets are not related, but people have lots of interests. And so if you are looking at something where you're going to be dealing with these things regularly, you're going to have people that happen to have the mindset for both simultaneously, but they are different mindsets, as you just said. I can partition this off and be in one mindset, and then I can move over here and be in another mindset. Is that it's not the same flow. And so when you have people where their primary mode of function is in the mindset of visual style for a user, they are not going to frequently be the type of person who is also really great at thinking about caching mechanisms and the trade-offs between local and server-side storage, etc. Right? So having the person who does the CSS say, oh, well, because you do CSS and CSS, it happens in a browser, therefore you should do service workers because service workers happen in a browser, would be like saying, oh, you do my lawn, which is on my property, therefore you should cook my steak because my kitchen is on my property.
I get the separation that you're saying, but there is a case where like both are like hierarchical thinking in an essence, like getting back to
Sure.
TypeScript and types and the model side of it. The model should be the first thing that really kind of dictates the architecture of your system, right? Like
I disagree.
well, maybe, yeah.
I mean, to an extent, as far as we're talking about shape of data, because shape of data is informed by how a person wants to accomplish a task. Because in order to accomplish a task, I need certain data as inputs to me as a human to be able to act on the world and change the world. And so in that much, I agree with you.
Which kind of makes me circle back to GraphQL a little bit, because everything's kind of like this object hierarchy graph of things, right? And as an end user, I want to do X with Y things, you know, so you, like, the nice thing about GraphQL is you can just say, hey, give me a list of users, for example, and then like, you don't have to do the implementation details of saying like select star from whatever.
Because like in JavaScript, you're actually just going to crawl the structure and just pull it out yourself anyway, right?
Yeah, so GraphQL gives you back an object of these, the shape of the data, it's nicely typed if you're using TypeScript, and then from that model, then you render out containers of like this. If
GraphQL's architecture wasn't what it is, you know, like, because you're literally saying, okay, take potentially 500, you know, things out of an array and restructure it for me. It's like that has computational penalties and costs, like.
Yeah, that's an implementation detail away
Yeah.
from the
Yeah.
subject. Like,
But it's like for front end guys, like I can mutate it without having to be a back end developer, right?
So anyways, the
Anyways.
point that I was trying to make is that like structural thinking and procedural thinking can kind of go hand in hand. I don't know. But yeah, I understand what you're saying. Like, I wouldn't expect like some CSS designer to also just by nature know how to like optimize network requests.
And this is yeah, so this is my point, and I think that this is a business layer problem. And I think that in large part it's due to the funding model but yeah, it's a business problem because people say, well, how can I conserve resources? Well, if you're working on stuff that goes in a browser, therefore, yeah, you must also enact the role of the engineer because you speak to the designer about how to do stuff in a browser. And I think that this is, it's not impossible. It's not that such people don't exist. It's just, yeah, that they're rare and the skill sets do not necessarily coincide. I mean, I just get so frustrated with mobile apps because, I mean, for example, iPhone texting app, you cannot copy and paste the text. So if somebody puts in an address, it can automatically detect the address a good portion of the time. But if it doesn't automatically detect it or it automatically detects it wrong, I can't select and copy, right? So,
It's tweaking, but I think you can, but yeah.
do you have an iPhone?
Yeah, it's a little fuzzy.
No, you cannot. You can't, in the iMessages app, you cannot copy text.
Oh, yeah, it can copy the whole message, but you can't like select a piece of it.
Exactly.
Yeah, so somebody puts some words like, hey, what's going on? Here's my address, and then a space. If he doesn't recognize the address, you're going to have to manually type it.
You ever encounter that with, like Google search? Like, how do I find, and then it's censored, so like it just goes, oh, I don't know what you're gonna type.
I've actually recently come across things where, well, first of all, let's get into different topics. Let's go ahead and say end of presentation.
Yeah.
As somebody has to say the thing, because since I'm the person giving the presentation, I can't say let's clap for the presenter. So somebody else has to say that. Jordan.
Round of applause. Yay!
Thanks. That's appreciated.
Very enthused about your presentation.
Yeah, and you were sleeping through the whole thing, so I know that it was.
Part of the thing. Part of it.
It's okay. I'm just teasing you. I'm not offended. I get what you're saying. I'm not offended at all. I was just teasing you. But so okay. So that's over. By the way, anybody that's watching online, if you found this to be useful and or entertaining and or it's just something you listen to help you fall asleep at night, consider a like, sub, follow. There are two things going on here. Twitch.tv/CoolAge86. That's me personally, which is often the Meetup as well, because we don't have enough presenters. Because since Corona times, and then Christian, who often presented, he disappeared for a while. But then there's the Utah Node.js channel, which is the YouTube channel, which is where this video will be permanently stored. You can subscribe to that as well, and then if you hit the bell, you'll get the notifications when we go live. I think tonight's meetup was pretty good. They're not all this good, and some are better. So anyway, and then again, let me see. I think there were a couple of questions. I'm a CSS guy, and I run Arch Linux, by the way. Yeah, like I said, I don't doubt the existence of such people. And then Jonathan Salas is telling us lies. He says, yes, you can select the text, but I think either he misunderstood or has a different version of iOS than I do. Maybe he's still on the iPhone 3G where you're allowed to do that stuff. I'm just teasing you there.
Just jailbreak your phone. Is that still a thing?
I
I
think
haven't heard that in a long time.
I think, well, everything that people jailbroke their phone for, except for the cool little TV thing when you press the power button and then it goes, except for that thing, which you can still do on Android, I'm pretty sure. Folders, night mode. I mean, pretty much.
I hated the interface, but I had the 2 or the 3, and I just hated the interface. So I jailbreak it every update, and then switch the interface.
Well, for the last probably 5 versions of iOS, because I used to jailbreak it because I wanted things that it didn't have, but in the last 5 versions or so, there's nothing that I want that Apple hasn't included at this point. Other than I would still jailbreak it. I would still jailbreak it if I could get the little old style tube TV voop when you press the power button. But I don't even know how you do that anymore.
Mysteries of the world.
Yeah. Well, maybe we call it a night.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
But before we do that, I need to know presenters for next time. So I've put up a schedule that's basically the AJ show because y'all suck at helping me with the presentations. So I've got stuff queued up, but I don't really necessarily want to be doing all of these presentations. I mean, I do want to do all the presentations, but I don't want to be the only one who's doing all of these presentations are presentations I want to do, but I don't want Utah Node.js to be the AJ show. I think I think it's good to have other presenters. But as long as we don't have people, it'll be the AJ show. But I don't want it to be the AJ show. So first of all, let's just talk about topics. What are some things that you people in this room would like to be learning about?
I'm interested in like middleware and how like all I've really done with it is been told to use it and use it. I don't really know exactly like what's inside of that and all of that.
So I will give the most thorough explanation that anyone in this room has ever heard about Express middleware next month. I will do that.
Okay.
And it will be all the really simple basic things that if you could understand what the documentation is trying to tell you, you would be able to glean from the documentation, but because the documentation hasn't been updated in 5 years and was never finished, and most of it says this behavior will be available in version 5, it's, yeah.
Why is it Express documentation has not been updated? Like, it's used everywhere.
Because
Does someone have control of it separate from the project or something?
This is the paradox of open source, right? Something becomes the most popular framework in the entire world. Well, not framework, but the most popular routing library in the entire world that the world has ever known. And open source software people are dumb. They're stupid, right? So we come up with great ideas, genius ideas that other people can't start to replicate to save their lives. But when it comes to how to get $1, we're clueless. And so all of the companies making money are not the coders, and they're using the coders that aren't associated with the company that's making money, so there is no money for the coders, and they have to go get day jobs. In the case of Express specifically, I think what happened was that they moved over to Go and Rust, the people that were interested in the project, because it just kind of became boring and they needed something new to chew on. But the reason that it has no movement is there's basically one dude who maintains it, and I think some would say that for me to say this is brutal or not untrue, but I don't know how you can counter it with anything else. Maintaining is a very generous term. He does respond to issues, but it is, unless somebody infuses money into Express, it is never going to be finished.
Is it still TJ?
No, he moved on to either Rust or Go. I don't remember what she did.
I know that he was building what, Apex something, or he
I
was
don't know.
building some like SaaS type of platform releasing that simplified. It's probably something along the lines of Vercel or.
I think I've heard of that as well. I think I've heard of what you're talking about, but I don't think it took off. But yeah, it would be nice if, again, these skill sets are just not complementary. Knowing how to get a project funded and knowing how to get a project built are just, they're not adjacent skill sets. Or adjacent's the wrong word. They are adjacent. They're not, whatever the word I'm looking for is.
Complementary.
They are complementary because when you have them together, you succeed.
I don't know.
Yeah, but anyway, you get what I'm saying. You get what I'm saying. You need a business partner in order to make a project successful, and you have to eschew some of the open source religion because a lot of it is wrong.
What were we talking about?
Well, we were talking about what
Presentations.
kind of presentations we want to do.
There we go.
Yeah.
And then you
We
brought
wanna
up
see.
middleware and Express. Okay. All right. Now
I think we
know
should
what
turn
we're
into
talking
the Jordan show.
about. What?
Yes.
That's fine by me.
No,
But, okay,
I'm
so we
doing
wanna-
the Rust one next month. So
We want to talk about middleware. I'm going to teach you tips and tricks about middleware that are going to save your life, and probably no one else will believe you, especially as a junior person. But maybe you'll get lucky. But I'm going to teach you the stuff that's going to make it so easy. And when you encounter a real world project, you're going to wonder, what in the flip are these people doing? Why is it so complicated?
Might have to join that one online. Be out of town next week.
Well, yeah, I think you'll want
That'd be really good though.
I've got, if you want to see the shortcut of it already, I'm going to do a bunch of other stuff as well, but just async router. So root async router. If we can bring this in here. Root. Of course. Oh, there it is. Okay, so this right here is a big part of what I'm going to go over. This is probably the most important part, is how to do async middleware.
Okay.
But in the presentation, I think I'm going to show 2 different ways of doing it. One that I recommend if you're doing, I recommend doing it a different way if you're exporting something to be consumed in the general space. If you're publishing something to NPM for people to use, I'd argue to go the zero dependency route. And if you're doing something for yourself or for your company, I'd argue going a different route where you use this package, and the difference being the convenience. When you export code, you want to export code that is fewer dependencies and fewer nuances. But when you're using things yourself, you have the liberty of using things that maybe you wouldn't do otherwise. So. But, okay, so that said, what else do we want to have? What other presentations type topics do we want to have? And by the way, somebody else is welcome to present on middleware too.
So, I know this is Utah Node.js, but is there any interest in covering some Dino or Bun and doing an experiment?
Do it.
Okay, that's why I'm asking, is I'd be interested in trying to figure something out to present on that.
I would love to have a presentation on Bun in particular. I think we'll see what happens. At first I thought Dino was going to do really well, but then Corona hit, and without conferences, without meetups.
I think it's actually still growing from some of the podcasts I've been listening to. It's been kind of... Actually, it may have been when you were on for, what is it?
JavaScript Jabber. I have no doubt that it's still growing.
Guy, or was that one you weren't on?
I think I was on that one. We've talked to a few of those people a number of times, but I think with Bun, Dino's going to fall flat because Zig is such an easier language to deal with, and the concept of Bun is more exciting in a lot of ways. So if Bun is both more interesting and, sex sells, right? So if you say it's faster, nothing else matters. All of a sudden, that's what's cool. So if Bun is saying that it's 4 to 10 times faster, that alone is going to attract people for the irrational reason that they go after the hot girl that they don't even like,
Or that they'll never get.
Well, if not with that attitude.
Yeah, bringing the whole room down.
Fun would be cool.
Bun says I can have it this fast, but it's never getting that fast.
Well, I think the concept of Bun is interesting. I think it's kind of an oxymoron though, because Rust is complex in the way that new JavaScript takeover is complex, but Zig is simple in the way that traditional JavaScript can be simple. The kind of JavaScript that I show here on the screen. I'm not showing a bunch of weird classes and this is just simple objects and stuff, right? And that's what Zig is like. And so I think it's kind of an interesting paradox that somebody doing Zig is not taking advantage of the simplicity of JavaScript that mirrors the simplicity of Zig. They're instead building on, I guess...
onto the TypeScript.
Yeah, which is not at all simple. That's more like what Rust is. Except Rust is Rust is elegant. It is complex, but it's elegant.
Is your use of inline functions versus arrow functions like a worry about CPU, like overhead of wrapping that in an arrow function? Or
I hate useless things in particular.
it's not useless. It's if the most important thing is human readability,
Then this is more readable because it's clear that this is a function, and arrow functions have 4 different syntaxes. 4 discrete syntaxes that not only have to be parsed by a parser, but have to be parsed by your brain.
Bring up the editor to this, or some text editor, and let me, in words, type it out, and then compare side by side what's more readable.
I like arrows personally.
Yeah. So, yeah, just edit that HTML. Or what?
Oops.
Sorry.
Don't be sorry.
AJ, can you convince them? Sure.
No, I'm not.
I'm
It's
not
stupid.
so-
It's more difficult to parse. I mean, just this whole equals, parentheses equals.
Zoom.
No, I'm not talking about that one. I'm talking
Zoom
about
and
your,
enhance.
instead of let gizmos equals filter, so after get gizmos, put a new line.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay.
I'm saying that
if you
inline
want to,
push.
you want to do it as a mathematical lambda, I can semi be convinced as a mathematical lambda because as a lambda is a lambda, okay. But I think the syntax is dumb. Yeah, I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying. Yeah. So I would appreciate it if they would have used lambda syntax, but no, I do not find.
And you can get rid of the curly brace and the return.
Right, which is terrible because now you have an
The
implicit
parentheses
return,
around the G.
and then
No, get rid of the parentheses around there, the curlies around the G.
no, I'm not doing it. Sorry, I think it's stupid. It's
more
stupid. No,
readable.
it's
If
like
that's
no,
your
it's
argument,
it's like an inline if. It's like an inline if.
I
It's
would do an
only
inline
going to
if,
lead
but-
to sadness.
If it's a named lambda, yes.
I'm
Or
a big
even
fan
a
of the
system
fatter
anonymous function that
function.
just returns something just like that, like it's, rather than having to parse another function name, you can just see, oh.
No,
okay, good.
no,
Upside
no.
down.
I'm not into it.
You'll never.
Buns
implement
node
a function-
interop is just a bludgeon to the Dino Dino. Okay, all right. I could believe that. I really hate the syntax of error functions. Creative, we're soul siblings. They look more like expressions than structured blocks. Yeah, still use them all day long. I'm sorry. Okay. Anyway, so let's wrap this up. But some more ideas. So bun.
My presentation on the algorithms again, or the presentation on the getting a job in tech for the first time.
That'll be good too. Let's see. What month? How about September or no? September, October for that one.
Okay.
Because that's when we get the influx of students, and
Yes.
that'd be the
I think that'll be a good draw.
yeah. I think
coming out of the boot camps and those coming out of college.
yeah. Let's see what we've got open here. Look, I got September open. You want to take September?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we can make any of them open. It doesn't matter.
The one where the college students are and the people are filing out of the boot camps. It's going to be. If you've seen the NASDAQ, it's only getting worse. I mean, they're gonna need all the help they can get.
So, Christian Rodier. Okay, and then what we're doing? Which one are we?
We're gonna do the getting your first tech job or coding job.
Let's see. How to get your first code job. How to ace the interview? I don't know.
Yeah, get the first coding job.
How to get your first coding job. All right, boom. Settled. So you give me the fascinating description and your updated bio. Josh, would you mind pulling Christian's bio from one of the previous presentations he's done, and we'll put that here to start? Because it's your responsibility, Christian. Oh, and Josh, would you mind contacting Christian you're on the Utah.js Discord?
I barely use it.
Well, what's the best way to contact you?
You have my phone number. Just text me.
Okay. Josh, will you bug me to get his number, to text him, to bug him, to update the description here?
Is Josh
Thanks.
like your secretary or something?
Josh is my assistant.
It's his AI.
Josh is my AI. But he's not artificial. He's actually intelligent. Yeah. So all of these things get transcribed, and whenever Josh's name pops up, it gets highlighted in yellow.
I was actually wondering if you used one of the transcription services to do that. So
Otter AI. Yeah. The idea was that I was going to finish writing my tool to basically pair these with blog posts. So every post is going to get the video and then some important timestamps and such and such. So I still want to do that. It's just, among the 100 million projects, I haven't gotten around to it. All right, so we're gonna have that. Let's go ahead and refresh. So Christian's gonna be here, and we're gonna get. Do you want to get your headshot tonight?
I don't need a headshot for this.
No, you're gonna have a headshot. That's how it works. You have a headshot. You're gonna have the Utah.js logo on the back. We're gonna pick some words.
I have a headshot, but I'll
all right, you send it to me.
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
You email it to me. We got to make sure we get that over to. Gosh, he changes his username every day. I can't remember his actual real name anymore. His name's Martin. He does the thumbnails. Okay. Okay. So other presentation topics that we want or that we want to present on. When do you want to do Bun? Do you want to do Bun in October? Do you want to do Bun? We can do multiple presentations in a night.
I think October.
October?
Yeah.
Okay. Josh, will you also make a second presentation for October? And then we can just decide which one we want to have first.
I mean, I mostly have a very loose concept of what I want to do.
Bun will be dead by October. Oh, shots fired.
Yes, and then if there's that presentation, I just, I'm scot-free. You can just do your thing.
Bun is dead. Long live Bun.
Yeah.
All right. Other thoughts and ideas?
If I wasn't so shy, I'd do a presentation, but I'm not gonna put myself in that boat yet.
What would you do a presentation on?
Maybe Vivint.
Hey, Josh, can you remind me to get you in touch with Travis about his presentation on Vivint? Thanks. All right. Will, what's your presentation going to be on?
I don't know.
You sent it to me in a text message, didn't you? You texted me somewhere. What was the? I forget what it was.
How Node developers can also do CSS.
It's not that they can't. Oh, we got a thumbs up on Vivint.
I was gonna present on embedding duct tape into an application.
Oh, that sounds awesome.
And how to. So I have that done. I thought I was gonna present on that today, but I will create a actual presentation. I'll show you guys how I use it for my text game and how to create content rapidly using code as content is what I like to call it.
All right, Josh.
Duct tape.
It's a JavaScript interpreter written in C that you can embed into an application and then script your application, much like Lua or Guile.
Is duct tape?
Lua's very fast. That would have been my second choice.
Has duct tape been updated, or is it still just plain JavaScript?
It's basically plain JavaScript for what I use it for, but I'm sure like the I haven't like upgraded at all, so like you can't use let because those are the ES.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's the new parsing. So the whole idea is that you're going to be running this on a JIT, so it doesn't matter whether interpretation is slow or complex because it's going to get JITted. But the additions to the language, such as arrow functions, the syntax comes into conflict with existing syntax in the language, and so it's automatic semicolon insertion on steroids because it's not just, let me see if there's a new line, and if I encounter an error, I'll back up one white space area and insert a semicolon. It's let me read an entire block, then figure out if there's an error or not, and back up the entire block, and then move forward again.
I don't want to interfere if you guys are doing stuff that's targeted towards students because that should be a priority. So I can do that whenever.
I mean, how many students are here right now?
Last time I did.
I'm constantly learning. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm a perpetual student.
But we had a lot of boot camp grads when you did that presentation last time, and I think we'll attract them again. Last time it was in Provo, and I wonder if being in Provo might have, because there's more boot camps in that area, right?
There's boot camps in Salt Lake County. There's boot camps here.
But it's mostly business. It's mostly working professionals in Lehi, but it's the nice middle ground for people that want to come up or go down. And I won't go up to Salt Lake on a moral principle.
Plus on
Well, unless we get a good sponsor and we can get back to having 30 people again, but I think everybody up in Salt Lake is still believes in certain fairy tales that their government's telling them.
plus, you know, when I gave that presentation, it was on the tail end of the pandemic, so a lot of people were scared. They didn't want to come in and whatnot. But you know, there's plenty of people in boot camps that that study remotely, living in Salt Lake County. There's also people all spread out throughout Utah County. So I think we can get a good turnout. It's usually a popular thing as long as we promote it.
Well, yeah, we just need to put it up there and get a good thumbnail on it and just let people know, post it in the chats and stuff. Okay, all right. Anything else? Any other ideas you want to present on? Things we should present on, or you want to learn about?
Ton of endless topics.
Yeah. One that might be interesting is like Node on the edge, or like edge computing.
Node's dead on the edge. That's what we got Bun for. But yeah,
Or
sure.
Or I know Dino's got some, or like that's part of. I think that's a part of like the messaging.
Well, there's a new standard. What is it? Is it Cloudflare that's doing the standard? They're creating another JS foundation because when there's 27 competing standards of groups that can't agree, throw one more in. Which actually maybe it'll be one ring to rule them all. But they're creating another foundation that is going to be JS on the edge, and it
Oh
is.
yeah, I heard about that.
Yeah, so we're going to get another standard similar to how we had Common JS and W3C and WhatWig, and we're going to have a special interest group for Edge JavaScript, and I think that actually is quite relevant. And Ryan is really interested in that too, so I think that'll be a good presentation. I think that's actually quite relevant. Who would be the right person to? I mean, you've got the questions.
That's why I'm asking the question.
But that makes you the right person to go find the answers because you've got it top of mind.
Well, so the thing that got me interested in edge computing was like edge rendering with like with Nuxt.js, which is like Next.js review.
Yeah.
And then things like Fresh, which is a Dino framework. Also,
It sounds like you're the right person to give this presentation. If nothing else, you can give the landscape.
yeah. I would not be opposed to giving it. I just don't know if I will be motivated because I'm moving out to Tooele. I don't know if I want to drive like
When are you moving to Tooele?
like August 20-ish. Well,
Let-
the week.
Well, lucky for you, our next meetup is August 18th. So we'll start with you. How about
No
that?
pressure.
Well, what the heck?
Yeah! Woo!
I've already given a presentation before, so it'd be my first one.
Oh, it's fine. It's fine. I mean, hopefully I've set the bar pretty low. I mean, I didn't even finish my slides. So
They were full of typos.
yeah, they're full of typos and code that won't run. Okay, so
Shadow variables.
I know it starts with a C or a K. Caleb? Caleb. Okay. So Josh, will you also make a second presentation for August? It's going to be Caleb about JavaScript at the edge. And do I have your information, Caleb?
I think you have my number.
Let me see. Is it a C or a K?
It's a K.
It's a K.
Yeah, Caleb Erkenbrecht.
Caleb, Utah Node.js.
I'm on
Okay.
the Discord as well.
All right.
Say it out loud for all the viewers out there.
No, I'm not doing that one. But what was your username on the Utah.js?
It's just my name.
Okay, just Caleb with a K. All right, Josh.
Well, that's
Caleb
like
with a K.
my server name. My like Discord name is Kremit.
Oh, it's credit?
Kremit. Like
Kremit?
the frog, but spelled wrong.
Okay, Kremit. Okay, Josh, it's Kremit.
Well,
Wait,
Huh?
I see Caleb Ekrenbach. This,
no, I was gonna ask you.
I don't see Kremit on the Utah.
Do you ever
I'm
just
not
be
sure
like,
which
Josh,
shows up as. 'cause
remind me to pay Will $500.
Is it Ekrenbach?
Erkenbrag.
Erkenbach. Okay,
That would be
Erkenbach.
nice.
All right.
Like, I couldn't remember if it shows up, like, search for me through.
Cowtel
that.
says, it seems like I've arrived nearly 2 hours late. Yeah, indeed you did, Cowtel. What's the summary on why MVC may or may not be dead? Does anybody want to...
Well,
Also creative. Yes, there. If you look in the history of the Utah Node.js YouTube channel, there is a presentation that I did that was actually called "How to Deploy Node in 2022." So if you look back at that, you can. I don't know if the link was updated here, but if we went to past presentations, you can find this on the YouTube channel. Let me make sure the YouTube channel is here. Can I do Y? Is it? Nope, I don't have the command set up for that. Anyway, it's there. Sorry, and I already lost my train of thought. What was the last thing?
he showed up 2 hours late and you wanted.
Oh, the
like,
summary. Yeah. So
the
somebody give the
summary.
summary. Why is MVC may or may not be dead?
My understanding is if you're gonna have a very limited microservice, small, using MVC is kind of like using a sledgehammer to smash an ant. It's an overkill. Otherwise, you just want to do more of a monolith. That's my takeaway from the presentation.
Or you could look at it that it's more of a clickbaity title, and the concept of MVC is still alive.
He
but
said it, I didn't.
But the argument or the vocabulary in describing the separation of concerns has evolved.
Okay, so yeah, I'll rephrase it myself and combine both of those. If you are trying to fit a presentation on a slide demonstrating the separation of concerns, you probably will end up with a slide that's so simple and easy to read that separating the concerns takes up more slides and is therefore less readable. So this is pretty readable and easy to understand if we break it down into the model is summarized as the get the right stuff in the right shape, which is what this is. The controller is summarized as do the business logic, do the things, which is what this is, and it takes in model-y stuff. And then this is kind of viewish, and this is the summary of the other ones. This is how to get the information in the right format for what the user wants to interact with. So if you're doing it in slides, then the quote-unquote monolith fits in a slide. It's easy enough to read. Trying to break it down, it's actually more slides to look at, although all of these could be in a single file. So the reason that it's dead is because people just aren't talking about design patterns anymore. With the context of this is a pattern for how to design something, and here's a couple of words or acronyms that you can use. But the idea of split things up into logic that is about storage, into logic that is about doing stuff with the information to arrive at different results, and the logic about how to form it into a way that a person can interact with it, be it in a web browser or a command line or an API, is still a good pattern to use, regardless of whether you call it MVC or something else. Actually, I didn't summarize. I just regave the presentation in 5 minutes.
Summarized as clickbait title.
But it's not really a clickbait title. It's because I couldn't...
Why the MVC is dead?
Well, MVC is dead is because people aren't talking about it. I can't find any presentations or any talks that talk about design patterns that follow this pattern. When I was searching for stuff, I could not find recent conference talks that are like, when you're building an application, here's a way to segment your application into logical units that have areas of responsibility that are, that lead to increased reliability and testability.
Well, I think even your examples here, like most often, like having started with MVC, I think of MVC still kind of in the PHP, like.
The Rails
you
way?
have- Yeah, kind of, you have your PHP code, that's, you know, model controller-ish stuff, and then you've got your view of your HTML type of presentation layer, maybe some CSS type stuff jammed in there. And so I have it in my mind in those cases, but you've got, you're reorganizing just parts of JavaScript that all seem just like different shaped functions type of thing. And so I think you've applied it all to JavaScript without ever showing, like, this is how it's viewed from the end user's perspective. And I think I often take an end user perspective, but you're taking it as the programmer is the end user perspective.
Well,
and so,
yeah, I mean, if I wanted to add more slides, and perhaps I actually should. If I was giving this presentation again, I think I would show the same pattern but done on the browser side. But that's the idea, is that if I write a command line tool, CrowdNode, right? That has a view. That is what you type at on the command line. You are interacting at the view layer. The view layer is where where the consumer of the product interacts with the product. And if you were to take this right here, this would be your React component thing. Maybe would be this.
I guess what I was kind of trying to get to, but I rambled, was you could have MVC applied at multiple levels.
Yes.
In different ways. And
Yes.
so this is applied in one section that might all look very similar, but it's actually the model view controller pattern. And then you could apply it at the next level as well, where you're implementing this in
Yes.
the actual HTML, CSS, whatever. You've got model view again. And maybe there's another level implementing the CLI. You've got a new model view controller implementation. And so that's what I was getting to.
No, that is perfectly said. That is exactly what I am saying. And what I was originally, when I asked the question in the Utah.js Slack, I'd asked, are there any good presentations on the dual MVC pattern? And by dual MVC, what I meant was JSON is the view of your API, and HTML, or rather CSS, is the view of your client-side app. And I just got crickets. So yeah, if I
don't know of any personally, so.
If I was going to do the presentation again, I would add a similar thing to this, but a similar set of slides, like what we did here, and I would do it with the HTML in mind. But to me, and this might be a little bit because I'm too in my own space with this. To me, this is obviously a view, but I could definitely understand that to many people, they might not make the connection that this is a view because they were taught a view is HTML and that's what a view is, which
So I'm self-taught, so I wasn't exactly taught that. That's just what I inferred based on how I learned things at the time I was learning these things. And that's kind of how it was. It wasn't like anyone sat down and went, all right, a view is HTML and CSS, like no one explained it to me that way. That's just kind of how it seemed.
Right. Yeah. And again, that goes to the why I think it's kind of died, is because the paradigm changed and people threw out the baby with the bathwater. The baby was the separation of concerns into discrete components, and the bathwater was that it's a CRUD Rails app.
So I think the reason that I actually gravitate towards Vue versus React is I always love the single file components because it let you have kind of the MVC pattern in one single component, but you got to separate your CSS and your JavaScript and your HTML.
And Svelte is the same way, right?
Svelte is very similar, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and
I like Svelte too. Still hate React though.
I see the appeal of that. I see the appeal of that. I just, if the transpile step is lightweight enough, if it's literally search for the file until you see this comment or this syntax indicator, and then move them apart, I could be really happy with that. If the transpiling is at the level of copy and paste, I'm okay with that. But when the transpiling is at the level of, okay, write an entire language and interpreter for this thing, do some crazy optimization, repackage, zipify it, and write a bytecode interpreter that ships with the browser. At that point, I'm out. Which I don't know if Svelte does that. I know there's one that was actually literally doing that, where it did a bytecode
Svelte
interpreter.
is all about you're basically shipping plain, like vanilla type JavaScript. So it wouldn't be shipping a bytecode type of thing, but
It doesn't use a VDOM.
yeah.
React, you have to have a runtime to interpret the component, where what I understand with Svelte is that it compiles down to just click it.
All right, well, at this point, I need to get going home.
Yeah.
I've got a wife and a four-wheeler to tend to. So,
Four-wheeler and a 4-year-old?
oh, and a 3-year-old.
Oh, 3-year-old.
All right, so thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in online. Again, like, sub, follow if you want to. Let me bring that up. Where'd the reply commands go? Reply command is like. There we go. That makes sense. Like. All right, and adios.
It was mostly about kind of like 2.7, how it's
Yeah, it's supposed to be 2.7. There's like
You are welcome for the stream.
playing around with this.
Oh, should we raid somebody? Let me check and I can't raid. I'm not signed into Twitch for the Utah.js account. All right, have a good one. Bye.